Hello, my name is Ajak Noi-Dwol, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the effects of colorism on the Black community. So, growing up, I was constantly bullied because I was always more than likely going to be the darker skinned person in the class, not only by my white peers, but also by my other Black peers. And that always confused me growing up because I always thought, well, we're all Black, so what makes me any more different than you besides the fact that I'm a few shades darker than you? But as I started to grow, I started to realize that colorism is a heavily ingrained thing in the Black community. And it all stems back to slavery and all of that. And it's heavily normalized, which it shouldn't be. But the comments that the kids would make about my skin ultimately ended up affecting me and my self esteem. Um, Affected how I viewed myself. I always thought I wasn't pretty enough because I was too dark. And it just affected how I interacted with my other Black peers because I was always on the fence. Like, what if they won't like me because I'm darker than them? What if they think I'm mean because I'm darker than them? It always stemmed back to my skin tone. And I always thought it was weird because, like I said before, we're all Black. What makes me any different than you besides my skin tone being a few shades darker than yours? But as I started to grow up and learn, I realized how normalized colorism is in the Black community, how it's constantly brushed off, especially towards Black women, and how it affects Black women more than it does Black men. I'm not saying Black men can't experience colorism, but it affects Black women more than it does Black men. Many Black people of darker complexions experience colorism, but due to the normalization of it, it goes heavily ignored, so it's not really a spoken about topic. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about what colorism is and where does it stem from, how the Black community continues to perpetuate colorism, and how colorism affects students at colleges, including HBCUs and PWIs. Many Black people don't know what colorism is and where it stems from. Colorism is the manifestation of the intense racism and discrimination that Black people have faced all throughout history. So, colorism stems back to slavery and the slave mentality of, lighter is better. The closer you are to Eurocentric, the closer you are to being European, the better you are, the smarter you are. In an article I read by Kerr, 2005, she discussed how European beauty standards heavily impacted colorism. She talks about things called a study called the paper bag principle, which is basically where they took a brown paper bag and they held it up to your face, and if you were lighter than the paper bag, then you were deemed as okay, or they would use it to grant you entry into like clubs, like organizations and stuff like that. And if you were darker than the paper bag, then you were turned away. Kerr also discussed how internalized racism and discrimination play a big role in colorism. All of the racism that Black people experienced throughout all of history, stemming back to slavery, of course, ended up being internalized and manifested into colorism. So that ultimately affects how we view other Black people. Even though we don't mean to, we still do ultimately end up stereotyping other Black people based on their skin tones. Because of the internalized racism, the Black community ultimately plays a huge role in the perpetuation of colorism. They, without realizing, uphold colorist views in households, which could ultimately affect the youth, more specifically the women and girls growing up in the household. In an article by Wilder Kane, 2011, they discussed the effects of colorism in Black households, where they interviewed 29 Black women, and all of them ended up saying how no, colorism is heavily normalized in their households, how it's almost taught rather than taught against. It's a normal thing, like it just happens without realization. These colorist ideals ultimately end up trickling up to uh, universities, so things such as HBCUs. So the so these universities often end up upholding colorist views towards specifically Black women, like I said before. Colorism also follows women not only from HBCUs but also to PWIs, which ultimately ends up with them confused with their identity and wondering where they fit in, which was discussed in Hemingway 2003. His article discussed how colorism affected the identities of Black women at PWIs. In an article by Opugo and Mibli Shaka 2020, they discussed how complexion privilege and color bias play a huge role at HBCUs, and basically how they carry out their punishments for certain things. Like, it's very slight, but there is often favoritism for lighter skinned students than there is for darker skinned students due to stereotypes associated to skin tones. So in order for the Black community to ultimately combat colorism, we must all be willing to learn and denormalize those damaging ideals. We need to realize how these toxic ideals end up following Black youths into their adulthood, which could also end up affecting their children and their children's children. It will always be a cycle until we figure out a way to denormalize and get rid of these toxic ideals, and until we recognize colorism as a real issue and stop brushing it off as just little banter and little jokes. We, as a whole Black community, will not ever move past it. So to close, I would like to end with a quote from one of my favorite songs called Complexion by Kendrick Lamar. And he says, "So I'ma say something that's vital and critical for survival of mankind, if he lying. Color should never revile. Beauty is what you make it. I used to be so mistaken by different shades of faces." Thank you.